The silver serving spoon trembled in Eliza's calloused hands as she ladled the still-warm cornbread onto bone china plates, each golden square carrying enough oleander extract to stop a grown man's heart. In 12 minutes, the entire Grimwold household would sit down to their final supper. This is the story of how one enslaved woman's quiet rebellion became Memphis's most whispered secret, a tale that reveals how far desperation can drive the human spirit when dignity becomes more valuable than survival. The humid air of August 23, 1857, hung thick as molasses over the Grimwold estate on Adams Street, where the scent of magnolia blossoms couldn't quite mask the stench of human misery that clung to the servants' quarters. The floorboards of the grand kitchen creaked under Eliza's bare feet as she moved between cast-iron pots and copper kettles, her movements precise despite the tremor that had started in her hands 3 days ago. That was when Master Thaddeus Grimwold had made his announcement. Eliza had been property of the Grimwold family for 23 years, since the age of 8, when her mother had been sold south to New Orleans and never seen again. She had learned to cook at the iron stove that dominated the kitchen's eastern wall, her recipes becoming legendary among Memphis's plantation elite. Dorothea Blackmere, who visited every Tuesday for afternoon tea, often proclaimed that Eliza's cornbread was divinely touched by God himself. The irony of those words would haunt Memphis society for decades to come. But 3 days ago, everything changed. Master Thaddeus, a portly man whose Confederate sympathies ran as deep as his gambling debts, had received an offer from Bartholomew Clayridge, a cotton broker from Mississippi, $800 for Eliza. Not an unusual sum for a skilled cook, but the timing struck like a lightning bolt through her carefully constructed world of small freedoms and familiar routines. "You'll be leaving Thursday morning," Thaddeus had announced, his voice carrying the casual indifference reserved for discussing livestock. "Clayridge needs a cook for his Delta plantation. Bigger operation than ours." What he didn't mention was Clayridge's reputation. The whispered stories that traveled along the underground network of enslaved people throughout the Mississippi River Valley. Stories of workers who disappeared into the cotton fields and were never seen again. Stories of punishments that made death seem merciful. Eliza had listened to these tales from Lucinda Ashwell, an enslaved woman who cleaned for the Fenwick family and whose husband had escaped from Clayridge's plantation 2 years prior. "That man ain't human," Lucinda had whispered during one of their clandestine meetings at the market. "He breaks people for sport." The decision crystallized that night as Eliza lay on her narrow cot in the servants' quarters, listening to the rats scurrying through the walls. She would not go to Mississippi. She would not become another forgotten soul in Clayridge's fields of horror. But escape was impossible. The patrollers knew her face, and winter was approaching. A lone black woman traveling without papers wouldn't survive 3 miles beyond Memphis city limits, which left only one alternative. For 2 days, Eliza had moved through her duties like a woman possessed, grinding corn, kneading dough, preparing meals with mechanical precision, while her mind calculated dosages and timing. The oleander bush that grew wild behind the carriage house had bloomed magnificently that summer, its pink flowers beautiful enough to grace any gentleman's lapel. Few people knew that those same flowers, when properly prepared, contained enough cardiac glycosides to stop a heart within hours. She had learned about plant medicines from old Ruth, the plantation's former cook who had died the previous winter. Ruth had taught her which roots eased childbirth pain, which leaves broke fevers, and which flowers, when prepared incorrectly, could prove fatal. "Knowledge is power," Ruth had whispered during those moonlit lessons, "even for folks like us." The afternoon of August 23rd found the Grimwold household in typical pre-dinner preparations. Euphemia, Larkspur, Thaddeus's spinster sister, who managed the household accounts, fretted over the evening's menu while her brother entertained Erasmus Dreadmore, a business associate visiting from Nashville. The conversation drifted from cotton prices to the growing tensions between North and South, punctuated by the clink of crystal glasses and the rustle of silk skirts. Honoria Coldenridge, Thaddeus's wife, spent the afternoon in her private sitting room nursing another of her headache remedies, laudanum mixed with sherry that left her floating through most evenings in an opium-tinged haze. She rarely questioned kitchen preparations, trusting Eliza's reputation implicitly. As the dinner hour approached, Eliza moved with supernatural calm. She prepared the roast duck exactly as she had hundreds of times before. The potatoes were seasoned with her signature blend of herbs. The green beans snapped with perfect freshness. Everything appeared normal, routine, unremarkable. Everything except the cornbread. The oleander petals had been dried and ground into a fine powder 3 weeks earlier, mixed with cornmeal, and stored in a labeled jar that looked identical to dozens of others lining the pantry shelves. The bitter taste was barely detectable when mixed with molasses and butter, and the symptoms wouldn't manifest for hours after consumption. As 6 o'clock chimed from the grandfather clock in the main hallway, Archibald Fenhaven, the Grimwold's overseer, took his customary place at the servants' table in the kitchen. He would be first to taste Eliza's final masterpiece. The cornbread emerged from the brick oven, golden and perfect, its surface glistening with butter, its aroma filling the kitchen with the kind of homey warmth that made visitors to the Grimwold estate feel welcomed and safe. Poison had never smelled so inviting, but as Eliza arranged the squares on their serving platters, watching Fenhaven reach for his first bite, a child's laughter echoed from the main house. Little Tommy Grimwold, Thaddeus's 7-year-old nephew, had arrived unexpectedly with his governess for an overnight visit. Children changed everything. Even in her rage, even in her desperation, Eliza couldn't stomach the thought of a child paying for his family's sins. What happened next would depend on a split-second decision that would either save innocent lives or doom her to a fate worse than Mississippi cotton fields. The serving spoon remained suspended above the cornbread, trembling in her weathered hands. Time had run out. Before we continue down this dark path, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Drop a comment below and let me know if you're settling in for the evening or starting your day with this story. And if you're finding this tale as gripping as I am, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about resistance, survival, and the price of freedom. The question that haunted Memphis society for generations would soon have its answer. When pushed beyond all human endurance, how far would one woman go to reclaim her dignity? But first, she had to decide whether innocent blood would flow alongside the guilty. The child's innocent giggle from the parlor shattered Eliza's resolve like crystal against stone. And in that heartbeat of hesitation, she made a choice that would haunt Memphis drawing rooms for decades. The cornbread destined for the main dining table found its way to the kitchen scraps barrel, while a fresh batch, untainted, golden, and harmless, emerged from the oven just as the dinner bell chimed 7 o'clock. This single act of mercy would transform a planned mass poisoning into something far more targeted, far more personal, and infinitely more terrifying for those who witnessed its surgical precision. The main dining room of the Grimwold estate breathed wealth and southern refinement. Mahogany panels gleamed under gaslight chandeliers. Silver serving pieces caught the flicker of candle flames, and the Persian carpet beneath the guests' feet had cost more than most Memphis families saw in a year. Thaddeus Grimwold took his place at the head of the table, his jowls quivering with anticipation as he surveyed the evening spread. Erasmus Dreadmore, the Nashville businessman, occupied the seat of honor to his right, while Euphemia Larkspur fussed over the placement of crystal water goblets. Honoria Grimwold drifted into the room like a specter, her laudanum-glazed eyes unfocused, her silk gown wrinkled from her afternoon stupor. She rarely spoke during these dinner parties, content to push food around her plate while the men discussed cotton futures and the growing abolitionist threat. Little Tommy Grimwold and his governess, Miss Adelaide Whitmore, had been seated at the smaller table in the morning room, a decision that would save their lives and burden them with survivor's guilt for decades to come. But Archibald Fenhaven, the overseer who had spent the afternoon discussing Eliza's impending sale with typical callousness, remained at his customary spot in the kitchen. That placement would prove fateful. As Eliza moved between kitchen and dining room, carrying platters of perfectly prepared food, she appeared to the dinner guests exactly as she had for 23 years. Invisible, efficient, the human furniture that made their comfortable lives possible. None of them noticed the slight tremor in her hands or the way her eyes lingered on each face as if memorizing them. The conversation at the main table centered on Clay Ridge's expanding Mississippi operation. $800 well spent, Thaddeus declared, carving into his duck with theatrical flourish. Though I'll miss Eliza's cooking. Best cornbread in Tennessee? Wouldn't you say? Dreadmore? Divine Providence, Dreadmore agreed, unaware that Divine Providence had just spared him from oleander poisoning. My wife will be quite jealous when I describe this meal. What they didn't know was that Eliza had prepared a special batch of cornbread specifically for the kitchen table cornbread made with the original recipe, the recipe that would make Archibald Fenhaven the sole victim of her calculated revenge. Fenhaven bit into his third piece at exactly 7:15 that evening, praising Eliza's usual magic between mouthfuls. The bitter aftertaste barely registered as unusual. Cornbread made with coarse ground meal sometimes carried odd notes, especially when sweetened with sorghum instead of refined sugar. By 7:30, Fenhaven was complaining of nausea. By 8 o'clock, his vision had begun to blur. The first sign that something had gone terribly wrong came when Fenhaven stumbled while clearing plates from the kitchen table, sending a stack of bone china crashing to the floor. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot, causing conversation in the dining room to pause momentarily before resuming. Clumsy fool probably found my bourbon again, Thaddeus muttered to his guests, never bothering to investigate. But Eliza watched from the pantry doorway as Fenhaven gripped the edge of the kitchen table, his knuckles white, sweat beading on his forehead despite the evening's coolness. His breathing had become shallow, irregular. The cardiac glycosides were beginning their deadly work. Fenhaven's collapse came at 8:20, his body convulsing once, before going terrifyingly. Still beside the cast-iron stove, where Eliza had spent half her life creating meals for people who considered her less than human. The irony was not lost on her. The man who had negotiated her sale to Mississippi's cotton hell had drawn his final breath in the same kitchen where she had perfected her deadly craft. The sound of his fall, a dull thud, followed by the clatter of overturned chairs, finally drew attention from the main house. Death comes quietly when it chooses. Euphemia Larkspur was first to discover the scene, her shriek piercing the evening air like a banshee's wail. Something's wrong with Archibald. Someone fetch Dr. Morrison. The dining room erupted in controlled chaos as the gentleman rushed to investigate, while Honoria Grimwold remained seated, too drugged to comprehend the emergency unfolding around her. Thaddeus knelt beside Fenhaven's motionless form, pressing his ear to the overseer's chest, searching for a heartbeat that had already stilled. Heart attack, Dr. Morrison would later conclude, arriving too late to witness the symptoms that might have suggested poisoning. These things happened to men of his constitution. Too much rich food and bourbon. But Eliza knew better. She had measured the dosage precisely enough oleander to stop one heart, but not enough to leave obvious traces for a cursory medical examination. In 1857, sophisticated toxicology testing didn't exist in Memphis, and overseers dying of apparent heart attacks raised few suspicions among the medical establishment. The dinner party disbanded in hushed tones and awkward condolences. Dreadmore departed for Nashville earlier than planned. Euphemia took to her bed with smelling salts. The evening that was supposed to celebrate Eliza's profitable sale had become a funeral wake. As the house settled into an uneasy quiet, Eliza methodically cleaned the kitchen, washing dishes, banking the fires, preparing for morning as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. She had crossed a line from which there could be no return. The question that would torment Memphis society wasn't whether Archibald Fenhaven had deserved his fate. Few mourned the death of a brutal overseer. The question was far more disturbing. If Eliza could poison one man with such calculated precision, what prevented her from poisoning them all? And in the pre-dawn darkness of August 24th, as Eliza packed her meager belongings and prepared for the journey to Mississippi that could no longer be postponed, that question would find its answer in the most unexpected way possible. The cornbread had claimed its first victim, but the recipe remained. The paddle wheeler Belle of Natchez churned through muddy Mississippi waters at dawn. On August 25th, its cargo hold packed with cotton bales and human flesh bound for auction, while Eliza stood at the stern rail, watching Memphis disappear into morning mist. In her traveling sack, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, lay a small jar of ground oleander petals, enough to season a dozen more meals if circumstances demanded such seasoning. What Eliza discovered at Bartholomew Claridge's Shadowmere Plantation would prove that some fates are worse than death, and some forms of resistance require a cook's precise understanding of doses, timing, and the bitter mathematics of survival. The Mississippi Delta stretched endless and flat as a gravestone under the August sun, broken only by the serpentine curves of drainage ditches and the geometric precision of cotton rows that disappeared into heat shimmer. The air tasted of river silt and rotting vegetation, thick enough to chew, while the steady rhythm of work songs drifted from the fields where bent figures moved like broken clockwork mechanisms. Shadowmere Plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of the most fertile and most cursed land in Bolivar County. Bartholomew Claridge met the paddle wheeler at Rosedale Landing personally, his pale eyes cataloging his new purchase with the clinical detachment of a livestock trader. A thin man with prematurely white hair and hands that never seemed to stay still, he possessed the kind of quiet intensity that made field hands look at the ground when he approached. Local rumors claimed he had killed his first overseer with his bare hands for allowing a slave to escape, though no charges were ever filed. $800, he murmured to himself as Eliza stepped onto the wooden dock, her legs unsteady after 2 days on the river. You'd better be worth every penny. The journey to Shadowmere took 2 hours by wagon, past abandoned homesteads and fields where cotton plants grew wild and untended. Eliza counted 17 crosses along the roadside crude wooden markers that Claridge's driver, a free man of color named Samuel, identified with barely concealed bitterness. Runaways, Samuel whispered when Claridge rode ahead to scout the road, or ones who tried to run and got caught. Master Bartholomew likes to make examples. The plantation house rose from the delta like a fever dream. White columns supported a sagging roof, paint peeled from shutters that hung at odd angles, and Spanish moss draped the oak trees like funeral shrouds. But it was the kitchen building, separated from the main house by a covered walkway, that drew Eliza's attention. Smoke rose from its chimney in steady, purposeful streams, and the scent that carried on the evening breeze contained notes. She recognized herbs, spices, and something else that made her stomach clench with recognition. The previous cook had been a woman named Celia, a Creole from New Orleans, who had maintained Claridge's table for 6 years before succumbing to what the plantation doctor called river fever. The quarters where Eliza would sleep still contained traces of Celia's presence, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, recipe notes scratched into the wooden walls, and a small leather journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Eliza discovered that journal on her 3rd night at Shadowmere, and its contents revealed why Celia had died so conveniently just before Eliza's arrival. August 10th, 1857. Master Bartholomew brought another girl from the fields today. She won't eat. None of them eat when they first come to the house. I cannot blame them. August 15th, 1857. made the special tea again. Hemlock and valerian mixed with mint to hide the taste. She drank it all. Master Bartholomew says she looks peaceful now. More peaceful than the others who fought. The terrible truth crept through Eliza's understanding like poison through veins. Celia hadn't been just a cook, she had been Clayridge's executioner, using her knowledge of plants to prepare mercy doses for the young women he brutalized beyond repair. The journal contained dozens of entries, each documenting another victim, another dose, another quiet death, disguised as natural causes. Poison was already in the recipe. Clayridge's expectations became clear during Eliza's first week at Shadowmere. She would maintain his table, prepare meals for the handful of white overseers, and when required, brew the special tea that ended suffering for those broken beyond healing. The master of Shadowmere had purchased not just a cook, but an accomplice to his systematic horrors. Celia understood her responsibilities, Clayridge explained during their first private conversation, held in his study while a thunderstorm lashed the delta outside. I trust you'll prove equally adaptable. The study walls displayed his collection of curiosities, shrunken heads from South America, dried insects pinned in glass cases, and detailed anatomical drawings that suggested interests beyond mere plantation management. A locked cabinet held bottles of various powders and extracts, each labeled in Celia's careful handwriting, for sleeping, for pain, for endings. But Eliza possessed knowledge that Celia had lacked. Where Celia had used poison to grant mercy, Eliza understood how to use it to grant justice. Her opportunity came sooner than expected. On September 3rd, 1857, Clayridge's business associate, Erasmus Dreadmore, arrived from Nashville, the same Dreadmore who had dined at the Grimwold table the night Fenhaven died. His visit to Shadowmere wasn't social. He came to inspect Clayridge's special merchandise before a private auction scheduled for the following weekend. The merchandise being 3 young women who had been systematically broken for the entertainment of wealthy Delta planters. Dreadmore's arrival coincided with disturbing news from Memphis. A letter from Thaddeus Grimwold mentioned growing suspicion about Fenhaven's sudden death, particularly after Dr. Morrison's colleague had suggested that the symptoms, if accurately described, seemed inconsistent with heart failure. The Memphis authorities were asking questions about the dinner that preceded Fenhaven's collapse. Time was running short, and justice demanded immediate action. That evening, as Eliza prepared dinner for Clayridge and his guest, she faced the same choice that had confronted her in Memphis: mercy or justice, silence or resistance, survival or dignity. But this time, there would be no innocent children to complicate her calculations. This time, the Cornbread would finish what Memphis had started. The question wasn't whether Dreadmore and Clayridge deserved their fate. The screams from the main house had answered that question every night for a week. The question was whether Eliza could execute her plan before the suspicions from Memphis reached Mississippi, and before more innocent lives were sacrificed to the Delta's appetite for human suffering. The dinner bell chimed at 7 o'clock. Just as storm clouds gathered over Shadowmere Plantation, lightning split the Mississippi sky like God's own judgment, as Eliza measured 2 heaping teaspoons of ground oleander into the ceramic teapot, each granule representing hours of careful preparation and a lifetime of suppressed rage finally given tangible form. The thunder that followed seemed to shake Shadowmere's foundation, as if the earth itself recoiled from what was about to unfold in the plantation's candlelit dining room. This was the moment when Eliza's transformation from victim to executioner would be complete. But the storm brewing outside was nothing compared to the tempest about to be unleashed inside the human heart. The dining room at Shadowmere reflected its master's twisted sensibilities. Taxidermied animals stared down from the walls with glass eyes that seemed to follow movement, while the mahogany table bore scars from knives thrown during Clayridge's legendary fits of rage. Crystal decanters filled with imported brandy caught the flicker of oil lamps, casting prismatic shadows that danced across damask wallpaper, stained with humidity, and something darker that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Bartholomew Clayridge occupied his usual seat at the table's head, his pale fingers drumming nervous rhythms against the wood while he discussed business with Erasmus Dreadmore. The Nashville businessman had arrived that afternoon with a leather satchel containing $5,000 in cash payment for 3 young women who would disappear from Shadowmere forever after the weekend's private auction. "Quality merchandise," Clayridge was saying as Eliza entered with the evening's first course. "Properly trained, completely broken. No spirit left to cause trouble." Dreadmore nodded approvingly, his florid face glistening with perspiration despite the evening's relative coolness. "My clients appreciate discretion above all else. These girls won't be returning to their families, I assume?" "Family records were lost in a convenient fire," Clayridge replied with a cold smile. "As far as official documentation shows, they never existed." Eliza moved between kitchen and dining room like a ghost, serving roasted duck and sweet potatoes, while the 2 men discussed human lives as if negotiating the sale of livestock. Neither paid her any attention. Enslaved servants were furniture to men like these, present but invisible, trusted because their alternatives were unthinkable. What they didn't realize was that unthinkable had become inevitable. The storm intensified as the evening progressed, rain lashing the windows in sheets, while wind howled through the plantation's moss-draped oaks. The noise provided perfect cover for the sounds emanating from the main house's cellar, where the 3 young women awaited their fate in conditions that defied description even in Celia's detailed journal. At 9:15, Eliza served the cornbread golden squares that looked identical to those she had prepared countless times before, their surfaces glistening with butter and honey. The oleander had been mixed directly into the batter this time, ensuring that every bite carried its deadly cargo. She had learned from Fenhaven's death to use a more concentrated dose. These men would not linger. "Magnificent as always," Clayridge declared, taking his first bite. "Remind me to increase your rations, Eliza. Good work deserves recognition." Dreadmore consumed his portion with equal enthusiasm, praising the divine combination of sweetness and substance. Neither man detected the bitter undertones that proper preparation had masked with molasses and cinnamon. The tea came 20 minutes later, a special blend that Eliza announced as mint and chamomile for the gentleman's digestion. The ceramic teapot that had belonged to Celia now served a different master, its contents calculated to accelerate the oleander's effects while providing additional cardiac stress that would make the deaths appear natural. "Thoughtful touch," Dreadmore commented, accepting his cup with a benevolent smile. Southern hospitality at its finest. But as both men raised their teacups in a toast to their profitable partnership, a child's scream pierced the storm's roar, a sound so raw and desperate that even these hardened monsters paused momentarily. "Probably just nightmares," Clayridge muttered, though his hand trembled slightly as he set down his cup. "The merchandise has been rather emotional lately." That scream changed everything for Eliza. In Memphis, she had spared innocent lives by abandoning her plan. Here at Shadowmere, innocent lives were the very reason her plan had to succeed. Every moment these men continued breathing was another moment of torture for the women in the cellar. She retreated to the kitchen and waited. The first symptoms manifested at 9:45. Dreadmore complained of nausea, loosening his collar while sweat beaded on his forehead. Clayridge experienced blurred vision, blinking rapidly while trying to focus on the contracts spread across the table. Both men attributed their discomfort to the storm's oppressive humidity and their heavy dinner. By 10 o'clock, both were experiencing heart palpitations. By 10:15, Dreadmore had collapsed. Clayridge lasted until 10:23. His final words a confused mumble about calling for Dr. Henshaw from Rosedale. But the storm had washed out the roads, and the nearest medical help lay 20 miles away through impassable mud and rising water. Eliza found their bodies when she entered to clear the dessert service, their faces frozen in expressions of bewildered terror. The contracts for human trafficking lay scattered across the table, stained with spilled tea and the last gasps of evil men. Death comes quietly when properly seasoned, but Eliza's work wasn't finished. The three women in the cellar still needed salvation, and the approaching dawn would bring questions from overseers and field hands. The storm that had provided cover for her poisoning would soon end, leaving her exposed and vulnerable to suspicions that she couldn't deflect with claims of natural causes. 2 men dead in one evening at the same table might be coincidence. 2 men dead after eating the same cook's food would be investigation, arrest, and execution. The Cornbread had delivered its justice, but now Eliza faced a choice that would determine whether she became a legend or a cautionary tale. With $5,000 in cash sitting in Clayridge's study and 3 tortured souls locked in the cellar, she held the power to transform tragedy into liberation. But first, she had to survive until morning, and that would require one final recipe, more dangerous than any she had ever attempted. The storm was ending, but Eliza's revolution had just begun. Dawn broke over Shadowmere Plantation like a judge's gavel, its pale light illuminating 2 corpses slumped over a dining table still set, with the remnants of their final meal. While in the kitchen, Eliza methodically destroyed evidence with the same precision she had used to create death. The storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie stillness that would soon be shattered by screams of discovery and the thunder of approaching horses. This was the moment when murder transforms from secret sin to public catastrophe, when a cook's quiet rebellion would either become legend or lead to the gallows. And Eliza had less than an hour to determine which fate awaited her. The cellar beneath Shadowmere's main house reeked of human misery and rotting wood, its stone walls weeping condensation that mixed with tears and blood to create a soup of suffering that had fermented for years. 3 young women huddled in the darkness. Sarah, barely 16, who had been purchased from a failed plantation in Alabama. Rebecca, a 20-year-old mulatto whose light skin had made her valuable in Clayridge's twisted marketplace. And little Mary, who couldn't have been more than 14 and had been crying for her mother since her arrival 2 weeks prior. Eliza descended the cellar stairs at 5:30 that morning, carrying a ring of keys she had retrieved from Clayridge's still-warm corpse. The women cowered when they heard footsteps experience had taught them that dawn visits meant new torments. But Eliza's voice cut through their terror with unexpected gentleness. "I'm here to take you home," she whispered, unlocking the first set of shackles. "But we don't have much time." Sarah looked up with eyes that had seen too much, her voice barely audible. "Who are you?" "Someone who understands," Eliza replied, helping Rebecca to her feet. "Someone who finally did something about it." The explanation came in fragments as she freed the 3 women and led them upstairs to gather what little they could carry. Clayridge and Dreadmore were dead, poisoned during their business dinner the previous evening. The cash from the trafficking deal sat untouched in the study $5,000 that could purchase freedom, transportation, and new identities far from Mississippi's cotton fields. But freedom required more than money. It required eliminating witnesses and creating plausible explanations for what the authorities would discover when the bodies were found. Liberation tastes bitter at first. The plantation's white overseer, a brutish Kentuckian named Harold Wickham, made his morning rounds at 6 o'clock sharp, his boots echoing across the wooden porch as he approached the main house for his daily report. His discovery of the scene sent him stumbling backward in shock, his shouts for help carrying across the cotton fields like a death knell. "Master Clayridge, Master Dreadmore, something's wrong." Within minutes, the plantation buzzed with controlled chaos. Field hands gathered at a respectful distance, while Wickham and the other overseers examined the bodies, searching for signs of violence, robbery, or any explanation that made sense. The dinner table remained largely undisturbed. Crystal glasses still held dregs of wine, silverware lay properly arranged, and the remains of cornbread sat innocently on serving platters. "Heart attack," declared Thomas Ashford, a neighboring planter who had served briefly as a battlefield surgeon during the Mexican War. Both of them probably brought on by the storm's pressure. I've seen it before. Weak constitutions can't handle dramatic weather changes. The explanation satisfied most observers. But Samuel, the free man of color who had driven Eliza from the river landing, noticed details that troubled him. The tea service included an extra pot that smelled faintly medicinal. Clayridge's study showed signs of recent searching papers disturbed, drawers pulled out slightly. The cash box conspicuously absent. Most significantly, Eliza was nowhere to be found. A search of the servants' quarters revealed her few belongings gone, along with Celia's hidden journal and the leather satchel that had contained Dreadmore's trafficking payment. The 3 women from the cellar had also vanished, their shackles left unlocked and abandoned on the stone floor. Ran off in the confusion, Wickham concluded, though his voice carried uncertainty. Probably figured we'd blame them for the deaths somehow. But Samuel understood what the white overseers could not or would not acknowledge. The timing was too perfect, the disappearances too coordinated. Someone with intimate knowledge of the plantation's routines and secrets had orchestrated this liberation with military precision. By mid-morning, search parties had formed to track the missing slaves, their bloodhounds straining at leashes, while mounted men scoured the delta's maze of drainage ditches and abandoned homesteads. The reward posted by Wickham was substantial: $200 for information leading to Eliza's capture, $50 each for the 3 women. What they didn't know was that their quarry had never left Shadowmere. Hidden in the abandoned ice house behind the plantation's kitchen garden, Eliza and the 3 women waited for nightfall, while the search parties thrashed through swampland miles away. The ice house, unused since Clayridge's cost-cutting measures had eliminated ice deliveries, provided perfect concealment with thick walls that muffled sound and a root cellar that connected to the plantation's original storm shelter. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. They would hide until the initial search intensity diminished, then make their escape during the chaos of Clayridge's funeral arrangements. With $5,000 in cash, they could purchase passage on a riverboat bound for Cairo, Illinois, where underground railroad connections would provide safe passage to Canada. But first, they had to survive the next 24 hours without discovery, and the plantation's bloodhounds were already picking up scent trails that led uncomfortably close to their hiding place. As afternoon shadows lengthened across Shadowmere's cotton fields, Eliza faced a terrible realization. The dogs would find them before nightfall, unless she provided a more compelling trail to follow, one that led away from the ice house and toward the river, where the scent would be lost in muddy water and confusion. Someone would have to serve as bait, drawing the search parties away, while the others escaped, and that someone would likely not survive to see freedom's far shore. The choice between individual survival and collective liberation would define not just Eliza's legacy, but the very meaning of resistance itself. Time was running out, and the bloodhounds were getting closer. The bloodhounds' baying echoed across Shadowmere's cotton fields like the voices of the damned, their wet snouts pressed to earth, still damp from the previous night's storm. Following a scent trail that led inexorably toward the abandoned ice house, where 4 women crouched in darkness, counting heartbeats and calculating the mathematics of sacrifice. 20 yards, and closing the distance between liberation and the gallows, could be measured in a hound's eager stride. This moment would determine whether Eliza's rebellion died in Mississippi mud or blazed into legend. But first, she had to choose between the 3 innocents she had sworn to protect and her own desperate chance at freedom. The ice house reeked of mildew and rotting wood, its stone walls sweating condensation that dripped onto the earthen floor with metronomic precision. Sarah pressed herself against the far wall, her breathing shallow and rapid, while Rebecca clutched little Mary's trembling hand in a grip that left white marks on dark skin. Through gaps in the wooden door, Eliza watched the search party approach 6 mounted men led by Harold Wickham, their horses stepping carefully around drainage ditches swollen with storm runoff. The bloodhounds strained against their leather leashes, heads low, tails rigid with anticipation. These were walker hounds, bred specifically for tracking runaway slaves, their noses capable of following 3-day-old scent trails through swamp water and Spanish moss. The lead dog, a massive tan and black beast named Caesar, had never failed to bring back his quarry alive or dead. Made no difference to his reputation. "Trail's getting stronger," announced Josiah Cartwright, the dog handler imported from Louisiana specifically for this search. "Can't be more than a few hundred yards ahead." Wickham spat tobacco juice into the weeds, his pale eyes scanning the abandoned outbuildings that dotted Shadowmere's periphery. "Damn clever, hiding here on the plantation instead of running for the river. But clever don't matter when Caesar's on the scent." The search had been methodical and thorough. Armed patrols had swept the main roads leading to Vicksburg and Rosedale. Riverboats were stopped and searched at every landing between Memphis and New Orleans. Neighboring plantations had been alerted, their overseers armed with detailed descriptions and promises of reward money. But none of the searchers expected to find their quarry hiding within a half-mile of the crime scene, and that miscalculation had bought Eliza precious time to plan their next move. The cash from Clayridge's trafficking deal lay buried beneath loose stones in the icehouse floor. $5,000 in gold and silver that represented more wealth than most slaves would see in 10 lifetimes. Enough to buy passage to Canada, establish new identities, perhaps even purchase the freedom of family members still held in bondage throughout the South. But wealth meant nothing if they couldn't survive the next hour. Caesar's bark changed pitch, becoming more urgent, more focused. He had found something, a piece of cloth caught on a thorn bush, or perhaps scuff marks, where someone had climbed over the icehouse's low stone wall. The sound sent ice through Eliza's veins, even as sweat beaded on her forehead in the stifling air. "There," Wickham shouted, pointing directly at their hiding place. "Check that old icehouse." The moment of choice had arrived. Eliza pressed her lips close to Sarah's ear, whispering instructions with desperate urgency. "When I open this door, you 3 run for the storm shelter behind the main house. There's a tunnel that connects to the old well house. Follow it to the river landing. Take the money and find passage north." Sarah's eyes widened in horror. "What about you? Someone has to lead them away," Eliza replied, checking the small knife she had taken from Clayridge's study. "Someone has to buy you time." Through the door's gaps, she could see Wickham dismounting, his hand resting on the pistol at his belt. The bloodhounds were practically dragging their handler forward, their excitement building to a frenzy that would soon explode into action. But Eliza had one final card to play, knowledge that the searchers lacked, information that could turn their certainty into confusion. She had spent her last hour in the ice house not just hiding, but preparing, using techniques learned from old Ruth and refined through Celia's journal. She had created a mixture of herbs and roots that would mask human scent while creating false trails. The compound, smeared on clothing and skin, could confuse even the most experienced tracking dogs. The 3 women had been treated with the mixture before dawn. Their scent trails would lead the dogs in circles, buying precious time for escape. But the treatment only worked for a few hours, and its effectiveness diminished with each passing moment. Now Eliza faced the final test of her makeshift chemistry. She coated herself with the remaining mixture, then stepped toward the door with the grim determination of a general preparing for a battle that only one side could survive. "Remember," she whispered to the 3 women, "freedom isn't a place, it's a choice. Make the choice that honors those who didn't survive to make it themselves." The bloodhounds reached the icehouse door just as Eliza threw it open and sprinted toward the cotton fields, her figure dark against the morning sun, drawing the entire search party after her like a magnet pulls iron filings. Behind her, 3 shadows slipped from the icehouse and disappeared into the maze of abandoned buildings that surrounded Shadowmere's main house, carrying with them $5,000 and the hope that one woman's sacrifice might purchase their passage to freedom. But Caesar had tasted blood before, and his howl of triumph suggested that this chase would end, as they all did, with torn flesh and broken bones beneath the Mississippi sun. The question wasn't whether Eliza could outrun the hounds, but whether her sacrifice would prove sufficient to save the innocents whose freedom had become more important than her own survival. The final hunt had begun, and only one recipe remained to be tested: the bitter mathematics of martyrdom. The bloodhounds caught Eliza at the edge of Shadowmere's farthest cotton field, their teeth finding flesh just as the Mississippi sun reached its merciless zenith. But the screams that echoed across the delta that day weren't hers. They belonged to Harold Wickham, who had just discovered that a cornbread cook could be more dangerous wounded than dead. The 3 women she had died to protect were already halfway to Canada, carrying $5,000 and a secret that would transform the Underground Railroad forever. This is how one enslaved woman's final recipe became the most whispered legend in American history, proving that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin not with armies or proclamations, but with a kitchen knife and the precise knowledge of which plants can stop a human heart. The confrontation lasted exactly 7 minutes and 43 seconds, according to Josiah Cartwright's pocket watch. 7 minutes that would haunt Mississippi planters for the next decade and inspire countless acts of resistance across the antebellum South. When Caesar's jaws locked onto Eliza's left shoulder, she didn't scream or beg for mercy. Instead, she smiled and whispered something that made Wickham's blood run cold. "I already poisoned your well water this morning," she lied with perfect conviction. "Everyone on this plantation will be dead by sunset." The words struck the search party like lightning. Wickham's face drained of color as he calculated how many people had drawn water from the main well since dawn: field hands, overseers, house servants, even his own wife and children who lived in the overseer's cottage. If Eliza possessed the knowledge to poison 2 men at dinner, what prevented her from contaminating their entire water supply? "Check the well," Wickham shouted to his men, his voice cracking with panic. "Get Dr. Henshaw from Rosedale. Tell him we need someone who understands poisons." But Eliza's greatest deception wasn't the fictional well poisoning. It was the time she had bought for Sarah, Rebecca, and little Mary to reach the Underground Railroad station hidden in the ruins of an abandoned church 20 miles north of Shadowmere. By the time the search party realized they had been chasing shadows, the 3 women had vanished into a network of safe houses that stretched from Mississippi to Ontario. The truth about their escape wouldn't emerge until 1863, when Sarah published her memoir, Delivered by Death's Hand, in Boston. Her account described how they had used Clayridge's trafficking money to purchase forged papers in Memphis, posing as the house servants of a fictional planter's widow traveling north for medical treatment. The Underground Railroad had moved them through 6 states in 3 weeks, their journey smoothed by gold coins that opened doors and silenced questions. Rebecca settled in Toronto, where she established a school for escaped slaves. Mary, despite her youth, became a conductor on the Underground Railroad herself, returning to the South 13 times to lead other families to freedom. And Sarah used her portion of the Shadowmere money to establish the Eliza Foundation, which provided financial support for escaped slaves seeking education and employment in Canada. But what happened to Eliza herself remained shrouded in mystery that deepened with each retelling. The official record states that she died from her injuries at Shadowmere Plantation on September 4th, 1857, her body buried in an unmarked grave behind the servants' quarters. Harold Wickham's report to the county sheriff described her final hours as delirium and confession, claiming she had admitted to poisoning Clayridge and Dreadmore, while maintaining her innocence regarding the fictional well contamination. Yet disturbing rumors began circulating within months of her supposed death. A riverboat cook in Natchez swore he saw Eliza working in the galley of a paddle wheeler bound for New Orleans, her left shoulder bearing distinctive scars, but her eyes alive with fierce intelligence. A free woman of color in Mobile claimed that Eliza had appeared at her kitchen door during a thunderstorm, seeking shelter and medical supplies for infected wounds. Most intriguingly, plantation owners throughout Mississippi began reporting mysterious deaths among their overseers' heart attacks that struck healthy men in their prime, always following meals prepared by trusted cooks who disappeared before questions could be asked. The pattern was too consistent to ignore. Someone was teaching enslaved cooks the art of precise poisoning, sharing knowledge of dosages and timing that left no trace for antebellum medical examination. The Underground Railroad had found a new weapon, and that weapon bore Eliza's signature. Death serves many masters. By 1860, the Eliza method had become legendary among enslaved communities throughout the South. Cooks would gather in secret to share knowledge of toxic plants and preparation techniques, always speaking in whispers about the Memphis woman who had turned cornbread into revolution. Plantation owners began hiring food tasters and demanding that all meals be prepared under white supervision, but paranoia only deepened their isolation from the enslaved people who surrounded them daily. The Civil War's outbreak in 1861 transformed whispered resistance into open rebellion, but Eliza's influence persisted in unexpected ways. Union forces discovered abandoned plantations where entire households had died from apparent food poisoning, their deaths so precisely timed that supply lines never experienced disruption. Confederate officers reported widespread reluctance among their enslaved cooks to prepare field rations, citing superstitious fears about cursed recipes that brought misfortune to those who consumed them. Whether Eliza lived to witness the war's end remains unknown, but her legacy transcended questions of individual survival. She had demonstrated that resistance could take forms more subtle than rebellion, more lasting than escape. A cook who understood poison, possessed power that no shackle could constrain, knowledge that no auction block could transfer. The three women whose freedom she purchased with blood would carry that knowledge forward, teaching their children and grandchildren that dignity sometimes required terrible choices, but that those choices could transform suffering into strength. Her story became a cautionary tale, whispered in plantation great houses. Beware, the cook who smiles too readily, who asks no questions about missing travelers, who seasons her cornbread with herbs gathered from forgotten corners of the garden. Because some recipes contain more than flour and salt, and some hungers can only be satisfied by justice served at exactly the right temperature. The Shadowmere Plantation was abandoned in 1862, its fields returning to wilderness after 3 more overseers died under mysterious circumstances. Local folklore claims that on storm-filled nights, smoke still rises from the ruins of the kitchen house, carrying the scent of cornbread and something indefinably bitter that makes travelers quicken their pace and avoid looking too closely at the shadows between the trees. Even today, culinary historians researching antebellum Southern cooking occasionally discover handwritten recipe collections that contain suspicious annotations, measurements given in precise doses, warnings about seasonal variations in plant potency, and cryptic references to special occasions that required enhanced seasoning. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.